You imagine sitting down to dinner in the year 1347, just as the Black Death begins to sweep across Europe. Your meal consists of moldy bread, watered-down ale, and if you're lucky, a small piece of salted pork that's been hanging in your smoky hovel for months. This wasn't poverty. This was the reality for the vast majority of medieval Europeans. But here's what might shock you even more. The wealthy weren't necessarily eating much better. Their elaborate feasts, filled with exotic spices and massive quantities of meat, were slowly poisoning them with diseases we barely see today. The medieval diet wasn't just about survival. It was a complex web of class distinction, religious doctrine, and medical beliefs that determined not just what people ate, but who lived and who died. Today, we're diving deep into the dark reality of medieval nutrition, exploring the foods that sustained and sometimes killed our ancestors during one of history's most challenging periods, the foundation of medieval sustenance, bread and grain. At the heart of every medieval meal, regardless of social class, lay one fundamental element: bread. This wasn't the fluffy white loaves we know today, but dense, often gritty creations that served as both food and plate. For the common peasant, bread represented up to 80% of their daily caloric intake, making it quite literally the staff of life. The quality of bread served as a clear indicator of social status. The wealthy consumed white bread made from finely ground wheat flour, a luxury that required extensive processing and was therefore expensive. This white bread, known as wastel or manchet, was soft, relatively tasteless, but considered the pinnacle of refinement. The irony, unknown to medieval people, was that this refined bread lacked many of the nutrients found in coarser varieties. The middle classes ate brown bread, typically made from a mixture of wheat and rye. This bread was heartier and more nutritious than its white counterpart, though it was considered inferior by social standards. The poorest members of society consumed what was known as black bread, a dense, dark loaf made from whatever grains were available: barley, oats, rye, and sometimes even ground acorns or beans during times of scarcity. The process of making bread in medieval times was far more complex and dangerous than we might imagine. Flour was often contaminated with ergot, a fungus that grew on rye and other grains. This contamination led to ergotism, also known as St. Anthony's fire, a condition that caused hallucinations, convulsions, and in severe cases, death. The symptoms were so terrifying that many believed victims were possessed by demons. Grain storage presented another significant challenge. Without proper preservation techniques, stored grain attracted rats, mice, and insects. Weevils were so common in flour that many recipes simply accepted their presence. Medieval cooks would sift flour through cloth, but complete removal of pest contamination was nearly impossible. The consumption of insect-contaminated grain was not just accepted, but expected. The seasonal nature of grain harvests meant that bread quality varied dramatically throughout the year. Fresh grain in autumn produced the best bread, while by late spring, before the new harvest, bread became increasingly stale and moldy. The phrase daily bread held profound meaning in medieval times. It was quite literally a daily concern whether there would be enough grain to make bread. Baking bread was typically done in communal ovens, as individual households rarely had the resources to maintain their own. These communal ovens were often owned by the local lord, who charged a fee for their use. Another way the feudal system extracted wealth from the peasantry. The scheduling of baking created a social rhythm in medieval communities, with designated baking days that brought neighbors together. The alehouse culture, liquid sustenance. While we might think of water as the obvious choice for hydration, medieval people had good reason to avoid it. Urban water sources were contaminated with human and animal waste, making them dangerous to consume. Instead, the population turned to fermented beverages, particularly ale and beer, which were safer due to the brewing process that killed harmful bacteria. Ale was consumed by people of all ages, including children, throughout the day. It was considered food as much as drink, providing calories and nutrients that supplemented the limited medieval diet. The alcohol content was typically lower than modern beer, usually around 2 to 3%, making it possible to consume large quantities without severe intoxication. The production of ale was primarily women's work, carried out in households across medieval Europe. These alewives were essential figures in their communities, providing not just sustenance, but also serving as informal gathering places where news and gossip were exchanged. The quality of ale varied significantly, and regulations existed to prevent alewives from watering down their product or using inferior ingredients. Different social classes consumed different qualities of ale. The wealthy drank ale made from the finest barley and flavored with expensive herbs and spices. The poor made do with ale brewed from whatever grains were available, often resulting in bitter, thin beverages that provided little pleasure but essential calories and hydration. Wine held a special place in medieval society, particularly in regions where grapes could be grown successfully. In France, Italy, and parts of Germany, wine was the preferred alcoholic beverage among the wealthy. However, wine was expensive and often adulterated with various substances to increase profits. Lead-based sweeteners were sometimes added, unknowingly poisoning consumers and contributing to various health problems among the aristocracy. The medieval understanding of fermentation was limited, but practical knowledge developed over centuries of trial and error. Brewers knew that certain practices produced better ale, even if they didn't understand the scientific principles involved. The discovery that hops helped preserve beer was a significant advancement, though it wasn't widely adopted until the later medieval period. Mead, made from fermented honey, was another important alcoholic beverage, particularly in northern European regions where honey was abundant. It was often considered the drink of choice for special occasions and had mythological significance in many cultures. The production of mead required significant amounts of honey, making it expensive and therefore associated with wealth and celebration. The consumption of meat in medieval times reveals stark divisions between social classes and complex relationships with religious doctrine. For the wealthy, meat was not just sustenance, but a symbol of power and status. Medieval nobles consumed enormous quantities of meat, often eating it at every meal and in varieties that would astound modern diners. The medieval aristocracy's diet centered around large game: deer, wild boar, and various birds. Hunting was not merely a method of food procurement, but a defining activity of the noble class. Hunting laws were strictly enforced, with severe penalties for poachers who dared to take game from noble lands. The right to hunt was a privilege of the aristocracy, and the consumption of venison served as a constant reminder of social hierarchy. Beef was highly prized among the wealthy, though it was expensive and required significant resources to produce. Medieval cattle were smaller than modern breeds and were primarily used for labor and dairy production during their lifetimes. Only when animals became too old or injured for work were they slaughtered for meat, resulting in tough, stringy beef that required extensive cooking to become palatable. Pork was more accessible to the common people, as pigs were efficient converters of waste into protein. Peasant families often kept pigs, feeding them scraps and allowing them to forage in forests and common lands. The annual pig slaughter in autumn was a crucial event that provided meat for the winter months. Every part of the pig was used. Nothing was wasted when protein was so precious. Preservation of meat presented enormous challenges in the pre-refrigeration era. Salt was expensive but essential for preserving meat through the winter months. Smoking was another common preservation method, though it required significant amounts of wood and careful attention to prevent spoilage. Many preserved meats became so heavily salted or smoked that they were barely recognizable as their original form. The quality of preserved meat varied dramatically depending on available resources and skill. Wealthy households could afford high-quality salt and had dedicated spaces for smoking and storing meat. Poor families often had to make do with inferior preservation methods, resulting in meat that was either spoiled or so heavily preserved that it was difficult to digest. Religious restrictions significantly impacted meat consumption throughout medieval Europe. The Catholic Church designated numerous fast days throughout the year when the consumption of meat was forbidden. These restrictions were taken seriously, with violations potentially resulting in spiritual punishment. However, the definition of meat was often manipulated. Birds that lived in water, such as ducks and geese, were sometimes classified as fish and therefore permitted during fast periods. The consumption of exotic meats was a particular obsession among the wealthy. Peacocks, swans, and even dolphins appeared on aristocratic tables, often prepared in elaborate ways that emphasized their rarity and expense. These dishes served more as displays of wealth and power than as practical nutrition, representing the extreme inequality that characterized medieval society. Fish, the alternative protein. Fish occupied a unique position in the medieval diet, serving as both everyday sustenance and religious necessity. The Catholic Church's numerous fast days created a substantial market for fish, making it essential for both spiritual and nutritional reasons. However, the availability and quality of fish varied dramatically based on geography and social status. Coastal communities had access to fresh saltwater fish, which provided essential protein and nutrients. Common fish included herring, cod, mackerel, and various shellfish. These communities developed sophisticated methods for catching, processing, and preserving fish, creating trade networks that supplied inland areas with dried and salted fish. Herring was particularly important in medieval European diet and economy. These small, oily fish were abundant in the North Sea and could be caught in enormous quantities during seasonal runs. The development of efficient herring preservation techniques created a major international trade, with preserved herring becoming a staple food throughout Europe. Dutch and German merchants built fortunes on the herring trade, demonstrating how food production could drive economic development. Inland communities relied heavily on freshwater fish from rivers, lakes, and constructed fish ponds. Monasteries were particularly innovative in fish farming, creating elaborate pond systems that provided fresh fish year-round. These monastic fish ponds were marvels of medieval engineering, using water management techniques that sustained fish populations while providing controlled harvesting opportunities. The preservation of fish required considerable skill and resources. Salt was essential, but expensive, making fish preservation a significant economic investment. Different preservation methods produced different results. Some created fish that could last for months, while others provided only short-term storage solutions. The quality of preserved fish often left much to be desired, with many surviving accounts describing fish that was barely edible due to oversalting or spoilage. Wealthy households could afford fresh fish transported quickly from coastal areas, often kept alive in water-filled containers during transport. This fresh fish was a luxury that demonstrated both wealth and sophisticated logistics. The poor typically consumed heavily salted or dried fish that had lost much of its nutritional value and palatability during preservation. The medieval understanding of fish nutrition was limited, but practical experience taught people that fish provided essential sustenance during periods when meat was forbidden. Many communities developed traditional fish dishes that maximized nutrition while making preserved fish more palatable. These recipes often involved extensive soaking to remove salt and creative seasoning to mask unpleasant flavors. Shellfish presented particular challenges and opportunities in medieval diet. While abundant in coastal areas, shellfish spoiled quickly and were difficult to transport inland. However, they provided essential minerals and nutrients that were often lacking in medieval diets. The consumption of shellfish was sometimes viewed with suspicion by religious authorities, who questioned whether these creatures qualified as proper food during fast periods. Vegetables and fruits. The neglected nutrition. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people did consume vegetables and fruits, though their variety and availability were severely limited compared to modern standards. The medieval understanding of nutrition placed little value on plant foods, viewing them primarily as food for the poor or as supplements to more substantial meat-based meals. Common vegetables in medieval gardens included cabbage, onions, leeks, garlic, and various root vegetables like turnips and parsnips. These hardy plants could survive in harsh conditions and provided essential nutrients, though medieval people were unaware of concepts like vitamins and minerals. Cabbage was particularly important because it could be preserved through fermentation, creating what we now recognize as sauerkraut. The cultivation of vegetables was primarily the responsibility of peasant women who maintained small garden plots near their homes. These gardens were essential for family survival, providing variety and nutrients that supplemented the bread-heavy medieval diet. However, vegetable cultivation was precarious. Poor weather, pests, or disease could destroy entire crops, leading to malnutrition and hunger. Herbs played a crucial role in medieval cuisine and medicine, with many plants serving dual purposes as food and healing agents. Parsley, sage, thyme, and rosemary were common in medieval gardens, used both to flavor food and to treat various ailments. The boundary between food and medicine was blurred in medieval understanding, with many dietary practices based on medical theories rather than taste preferences. Fruits were seasonal luxuries that provided brief periods of sweetness and nutrition. Apples, pears, and plums were common in temperate regions, while warmer areas produced grapes, figs, and other Mediterranean fruits. The preservation of fruit was challenging. Drying was the most common method, though it significantly altered taste and texture. The wealthy could afford imported fruits and vegetables that were unknown to common people. Exotic spices, citrus fruits, and other delicacies arrived through international trade networks, often at enormous expense. These exotic foods served more as status symbols than practical nutrition, demonstrating the global reach of medieval trade while highlighting economic inequality. Medieval agricultural practices were often inefficient by modern standards, with low yields and frequent crop failures. The three-field system, while representing an advancement over earlier methods, still left significant portions of land fallow each year. This inefficiency meant that vegetable production was often insufficient to meet population needs, contributing to nutritional deficiencies and periodic famines. The preparation of vegetables was limited by available cooking methods and seasonings. Most vegetables were boiled into unappetizing porridges or stews, with little attention paid to preserving flavor or nutritional content. The lack of understanding about proper cooking techniques meant that many nutrients were lost during food preparation, further contributing to nutritional deficiencies. Dairy products occupied a complex position in medieval diet, providing essential protein and fats when available, but subject to seasonal variations and rapid spoilage. The production and consumption of dairy products reveal both the ingenuity and limitations of medieval food systems. Milk was primarily consumed fresh when available, typically during spring and summer when cattle were producing. However, fresh milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration, making it unreliable as a regular food source. Most milk was quickly processed into cheese or butter, which could be stored for longer periods and provided concentrated nutrition. Cheese production was a sophisticated art in medieval times, with different regions developing distinctive varieties based on local conditions and traditions. Hard cheeses could be aged for months, providing protein-rich food that sustained communities through winter months. However, cheese production required significant skill and resources. Not all communities had the knowledge or equipment necessary for successful cheese-making. Butter production was labor-intensive and seasonal, requiring large quantities of cream and considerable physical effort to churn. Butter was a luxury item in many medieval communities, too valuable to consume regularly. When available, butter provided essential fats and calories, particularly important during cold winter months when the body required additional energy for warmth. The quality and safety of dairy products varied dramatically based on production conditions and storage methods. Without pasteurization, dairy products carried significant risk of bacterial contamination, leading to illness and sometimes death. Medieval people developed practical knowledge about recognizing spoiled dairy products, but the risk remained constant. Religious restrictions also affected dairy consumption, with many fast days prohibiting dairy products along with meat. These restrictions created seasonal patterns in dairy consumption that aligned with production cycles but sometimes limited access to essential nutrition during crucial periods. The care and feeding of dairy animals required significant resources and expertise. Medieval cattle were smaller and produced less milk than modern breeds, making dairy products even more precious. The health of dairy animals directly impacted food security, and disease outbreaks among cattle could devastate communities that depended on dairy production. Different social classes had varying access to dairy products. Wealthy households could afford fresh milk and high-quality cheeses, while poor families often made do with whey or low-quality dairy products. The processing of dairy products also created employment opportunities, particularly for women who specialized in cheese and butter production. The medieval obsession with spices created one of history's most significant trade networks and fundamentally shaped global exploration and colonization. However, the use of spices in medieval cooking was driven by more than mere flavor. It represented medical beliefs, social status, and practical food preservation needs. Black pepper was literally worth its weight in silver during much of the medieval period, making it one of the most valuable commodities in international trade. This small, wrinkled spice was believed to have powerful medicinal properties and was prescribed for various ailments. The wealthy consumed pepper not just for flavor, but as a demonstration of their ability to afford such luxury. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and other exotic spices arrived in Europe through complex trade routes that stretched from Southeast Asia through the Middle East. These spices were so valuable that they were sometimes used as currency, and their trade financed entire kingdoms. The desire to control spice routes drove exploration and conquest, ultimately leading to the European colonization of much of the world. The medieval understanding of spice use was heavily influenced by medical theory, particularly the concept of balancing bodily humors. Different spices were believed to have heating or cooling properties, and their use was prescribed based on individual constitution and seasonal needs. This medical approach to seasoning created elaborate rules governing which spices should be used with which foods and at what times. Salt was perhaps the most essential seasoning required for food preservation and basic nutrition. However, salt was often expensive and difficult to obtain, particularly for inland communities. Different types of salt, sea salt, rock salt, and salt from various other sources, had different flavors and purities, affecting both taste and preservation effectiveness. Local herbs and seasonings provided more accessible flavoring options for common people. Wild garlic, various mints, and foraged herbs supplemented cultivated seasonings, though the knowledge of which wild plants were safe and beneficial required expertise that was passed down through generations. The preparation and storage of spices required considerable skill and resources. Whole spices had to be ground fresh to maintain potency, and proper storage was essential to prevent spoilage and contamination. Wealthy households often employed specialists who were responsible for managing valuable spice collections. The adulteration of spices was a constant problem in medieval markets. Unscrupulous merchants would mix expensive spices with cheaper substances, reducing quality and sometimes creating dangerous products. The development of regulations and quality control measures for spice trade became essential for protecting consumers and maintaining trade relationships. The methods and equipment used for cooking in medieval times significantly influenced both the flavor and nutritional value of food. The limitations of medieval kitchen technology created unique challenges that shaped culinary traditions and dietary practices across social classes. Open-fire cooking was the primary method available to most medieval households. This created intense, uneven heat that required considerable skill to manage effectively. Food was often burned on the outside, while remaining raw inside, and the constant smoke exposure affected both the flavor of food and the health of cooks. The management of cooking fires required constant attention and significant amounts of fuel, making food preparation a time-consuming and resource-intensive activity. Wealthy households had access to more sophisticated cooking equipment, including large fireplaces with multiple cooking areas, iron pots and pans, and specialized tools for different cooking techniques. These resources allowed for more varied cooking methods and better temperature control, resulting in food that was both more palatable and more nutritious. The poor typically cooked in single pot meals, combining whatever ingredients were available into stews or porridges. This method was efficient in terms of fuel use and equipment requirements, but it often resulted in monotonous, mushy food that lacked variety in flavor and texture. However, slow cooking methods did help extract maximum nutrition from limited ingredients and made tough, cheap cuts of meat more digestible. Roasting was considered the most prestigious cooking method, typically reserved for special occasions and wealthy households. Roasted meats were prepared on spits over open fires, requiring constant turning to ensure even cooking. This method produced flavorful results, but required significant fuel and attention, making it impractical for everyday use by common people. Baking required access to ovens, which were expensive to build and maintain. Most communities had communal ovens that were used on designated days, creating social rhythms around baking activities. The scheduling of oven use was often a source of community tension, as everyone needed access during similar time periods. Food storage presented enormous challenges in the medieval period. Without refrigeration, preservation methods were essential for maintaining food supplies. Smoking, salting, drying, and fermentation were the primary preservation techniques, each requiring specific equipment and expertise. The failure of preservation methods could result in food poisoning or starvation, making these skills literally matters of life and death. The cleanliness of medieval kitchens was often poor by modern standards, contributing to foodborne illnesses and contamination. Water for cleaning was often contaminated, and the understanding of hygiene was limited. Food preparation areas were often shared with animals, further increasing the risk of contamination and disease transmission. The medieval food system was fundamentally structured around social class, with dramatic differences in both quantity and quality of food available to different segments of society. These differences were not merely about wealth, but reflected deep-seated beliefs about social order and human worth. The aristocracy consumed enormous quantities of food at elaborate feasts that served multiple purposes beyond nutrition. These feasts demonstrated wealth and power, reinforced social hierarchies, and provided entertainment for the noble class. A single aristocratic meal might include dozens of different dishes, representing more food than a peasant family would consume in months. Medieval nobles often ate themselves into poor health, consuming excessive amounts of meat, wine, and rich foods, while avoiding vegetables and other foods considered beneath their station. This dietary pattern led to various health problems, including gout, obesity, and digestive disorders, that were actually indicators of wealth and status rather than signs of poor health. The merchant class occupied a middle position in the medieval food hierarchy, with access to better food than peasants, but restrictions based on both wealth and social expectations. Merchants could afford spices and imported foods, but were often prevented by sumptuary laws from displaying wealth too ostentatiously through their dining practices. Peasants and laborers made up the vast majority of the medieval population and survived on extremely limited diets that provided barely adequate nutrition. Their food consisted primarily of bread, porridge, and occasional vegetables, with meat being a rare luxury reserved for special occasions or times when animals had to be slaughtered due to injury or illness. The urban poor faced particularly challenging food situations, lacking access to agricultural production while competing for limited food supplies in markets. Urban food prices were often higher than rural areas, and the quality of available food was frequently poor due to transportation and storage challenges. Religious communities developed their own food hierarchies based on spiritual rather than economic principles. Monastic communities often ate better than secular peasants while maintaining strict rules about fasting and abstinence that shaped their dietary practices according to religious calendar and spiritual discipline. The serving and presentation of food reflected social status in elaborate ways. Wealthy households employed numerous servants, whose primary responsibility was food preparation and service, creating complex rituals around dining that emphasized the social importance of the meal participants.